Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. It seems this vignette from Shakespeare's As You Like It has never been more relevant to today's cultural and political climes. Partisan activists play the roles of journalists, and those intent on personal glory and power act the role of politician. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living through political theatre at its finest. But how much of the audience even realises this is all stage managed? Welcome back to Liberty Nation here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we talk the Joe Biden disaster zone, red flag laws, why no one really supports Biden for a 2024 run, and much more. I'd like to say a special thank you to our listeners in Evergreen, Alabama on WNWF 1470 AM and WPNS on 1140 AM. Thanks for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. With the latest results coming in from the primaries, they seem to favor Donald Trump and the America First movement, and things aren't looking very good for President Joe Biden. How long can he maintain a firm grip on American party politics? Well, that's a question that needs answering, and the person to do it is Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. Welcome back to the show, Tim. Long-time host of this here show, I must add.
Thank you. Always good to be back.
So, Tim, with primary election results, they're coming in fast and furious now, and we've seen some quite startling results, especially in the Texas 34th district with Mayra Flores flipping a long-held seat from blue to red. Now, that may not stay red as the special election only covers till January, but if you were a Democrat strategist right now, how would you be feeling?
I'd be feeling panicked, particularly about Hispanics, because that's the second most important constituency behind blacks for the Democratic Party. Joe Biden had 65% Hispanic support in the 2020 presidential election. He's now down to below 30% approval in a absolutely critical constituency for Democrats. The Hispanics, Mark, may be what they call a canary in the coal mine. That's sort of an advance warning of something that's coming. And if they cannot secure more of the Hispanic vote, I mean, it's a tidal wave that they're facing, not only in 2022, but in 2024, because they're already hemorrhaging with virtually every other group, including blacks, and Democrats are only issuing a 73% approval for Joe Biden. That's extraordinarily low for the party of the sitting president.
It is, yeah. I think that's the underreported story of the week, that the Latinos or Hispanic voters, they're just not pulling out for Joe Biden. Now, what we have to remember, I think, is that so many of these folks, they live near the border in the Rio Grande area. They don't like illegal immigration because of all the pressure it puts on wage growth, the crime that's associated with it, the cutbacks in services to fund looking after all the people coming across the border. And I think that it's really an area that Donald Trump got absolutely right, because when he said, build the wall to stop illegal people coming in, illegal immigrants coming in, he really resonates with not just, as the left-wing media would put it, the white racist voters, but people who work hard for a living, and those wages are going to be depressed because of an influx of illegal immigration. How does Biden deal with such a poor message?
Well, look, he promised one thing in his inauguration: unity. And one thing the American people are unified about is that they don't want an outpouring of illegal immigrants flooding over the border. Sure, liberals may be more open to it, but it's reached a point of real uncomfortability. We're setting records. It's one of so many things in which the president promised unity, and what he's doing is sowing division, because has reversed policies which were proven to work. But the contrast is now what's proving it, because you have a before and after. Joe Biden could make all kinds of claims from the cheap seats during the campaign, he could accuse Trump of anything, including being responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people from COVID. But, now he's in charge, and look at his record. So Trump's real play here is to compare his record with Biden's record. But if people are comparing records instead of personalities, it's pretty clear who would win in a rematch.
If Biden does decide to stand in 2024, which is a whole other issue that we may get into at some other point.
Yes, certainly.
He's got some problems trying to make the case for another 4 more years. So back to the primary results. Do you think that so far they've given any solid indication of what the country is thinking? Is the public regretting Biden, or with the prominent Trump endorsement wins, are potential voters worried of a return of what they see as the chaos of the 45th presidential tenure?
I'm increasingly getting the sense that the people who voted for Biden outside of the political activists, progressives, and those types are a little bit short of shocked at how incompetent, divisive, and angry Joe Biden has become. Now he is blaming all of his problems on the Republicans, on corporations. He's finding scapegoats for his mounting list of problems, and people aren't buying it. He's now underwater in almost every poll, to the point of being down into the 30s.
Yeah, I think what really struck me so much about this primary season is that the fourth estate, it's so determined to make every single race a referendum on Donald Trump. And by association, those people who supported Donald Trump in 2016, 2020, or both, it's almost as if the media has one message to push, and that's that most people don't like the former president. And facts, well, facts be damned, they have to take a back seat. I mean, if you look at the endorsements, Trump, he's batting, I think, at time of recording, 116 wins to 13 losses in terms of endorsements. Now, isn't this strategy of saying that most people don't like him, isn't it almost certain to backfire?
Well, with that, scorecard looks impressive, but let's keep in mind many of those were in non-competitive races, where there's just like a nominal competitor against the incumbent, for example. But he's still won quite a few more than he's lost. The ones that have not worked out for him are almost universally the revenge endorsement.
Yes.
It was a big mistake, it seems, to endorse David Perdue and to drag this longtime politician into a race to challenge the sitting governor in Georgia, Brian Kemp, because Trump was just infuriated. And so he did a revenge endorsement. It didn't work out. The ones where he's chosen carefully the people that he thinks are going to win have worked out well for him. Now, in the Nancy Mace race in South Carolina that was just settled, she's a South Carolina member of Congress, she voted to certify the 2020 election. And that was enough for Trump to support a challenger who lost. But Trump and May still are in good terms. But in another South Carolina race, Tom Rice, an incumbent who voted to impeach Trump and who was vocally anti-Trump, got slaughtered by the Trump endorsee. So where Trump is front and center, if it's not for revenge, he generally does well. But here's what's 100% successful in the Republican primaries, Mark: Trumpism. Because even those candidates that aren't getting Trump's endorsements are trying to convince the voters that they're the closest to his policies. Because again, separate the man from his policies. If you endorse and back his policies without explicitly endorsing his behavior, that is a winning formula.
Absolutely. Now, we're coming back with Tim Donner in just a short moment, where we'll discuss Biden's polling numbers, his legacy, his prospects, and a lot more. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, continuing our discussion with Liberty Nation senior political analyst Tim Donner on Joe Biden's White House tenure. So, Tim, we have to talk about Biden's latest approval ratings. Hit me with the numbers, please.
Well, there's a couple ways to look at it. The one way is that Joe Biden is lower than Donald Trump ever got in the Real Clear Politics average. He is now below 39% in the Real Clear Politics average of credible polls. Perhaps just as revealing is that he's below 40% in 5 of the 8 polls, and he's the 8 most latest polls. Yeah. And he is at 33% or below in a couple of recent polls. That is what you call rock bottom. Can't go much lower than that. And what's extraordinary about it, Mark, is that it's for a new president, 16 months into his term, and people have essentially given up and feel that he's a hopeless cause, which is why the New York Times has given permission for Democrats. Again, this is critical because this is scripture for the left. They've got scriptural basis to go out and support someone other than Joe Biden, which is simply stating what everybody else, the rest of us have known for a long time, which is that this guy can't possibly, maybe he could run again, but he can't possibly win again in 2024. The deficits are just so deep.
Yeah, I mean, it really is historically bad. And I think with those polls, I was looking at them as well. And so you've got when Trump was at his lowest point in the presidency, which was in the days following January 6th, 2021, in terms of approval, the House was getting set to impeach him. The media at large was putting out a message that Donald Trump is directly responsible for what they termed an insurrection. It was all on his shoulders. You take these two things together, and yet Joe Biden, without a January 6th, without an impeachment trial, he's managed to plumb these depths all by himself. You say there's no way he could win in 2024, but how does he come back in some measure from this in time to impact the November elections?
Well, I think that the Democratic Party at this point is bathed in a sense of hopelessness because things aren't going to get better for Joe Biden. His neurological decline, so to speak, is only going to get worse. It's an irreversible condition, and he's proven himself simply not up to the job. He's not going to suddenly be up to the job because he's not going to get younger. His ability to perform his job, to lead, to take control, to command the stage is not going to get better. He's in a very perilous position because in ordinary circumstances, the party would congratulate him, thank him for taking down Donald Trump, give him a gold ring, and send him out to pasture. But they don't have anybody to take his place because his vice president, the big global plan, of course, was to have her serve the second term of the Biden-Harris administration, whereas Biden has often said the Harris-Biden administration. Yeah. But that plan has fallen through the floor because she's a certain non-starter as a nominee, and all the rest of the ready-made candidates really devalued or even disgraced themselves during the 2020 primary. So the pickings are very bare. So the Democrats are in a really serious bind in which they can only hope that Donald Trump runs and they can get people to vote strictly about January 6th and the end of his presidency instead of the 4 years that preceded it, minus, of course, the pandemic.
But, you know, I've got a question about January 6th and how that's going to impact things. But something that just occurred to me is the White House has just taken on Keisha Lance Bottoms, the one-term former mayor of Atlanta, who was also a potential pick for Joe Biden's running mate in 2020. And I suspect we're going to hear innumerable stories from the fourth estate about what a wonderful communicator she is, because, I mean, there's desperation coming through there. Now, back to the January 6th thing that you brought up there. Do you think that the let's call it an inquisition that's taking place now and being
Show
televised?
trial.
Yeah, show trial, absolutely. Do you think that will sway the voters come November? Or, and this is where I'm heading on this, I think it's going to backfire. What do you think?
Well, I think it could have had an influence on November. I think it still will because of the wall-to-wall coverage of these hearings. 20 million people have watched that original, the first hearing in prime time. That's not an extraordinary number, but it's not small either. They had a chance to make significant gains if they had played it straight, if they had put on enough Republicans to at least make it appear that it was bipartisan. But instead,
you don't count Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger.
Well, and with Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, it's the fact if they were included but not the only ones, that might have been okay. But if you took 4, 5, or 6 Republicans, 4 of whom were, let's say, neutral or open-minded or not flagrant Trump supporters, and put on maybe 1 or 2 that did support Trump, what is Jim Jordan going to say to the horrific footage and everything? Is he going to be able to make Trump look good? No, probably remain silent. But the point is they had a chance to make this something. They could have been a contender, as the old movie said. But instead,
could have been somebody.
They could have been somebody, but instead they look like bums because it's just people bore witness to what a trial looks like in the old Soviet Union or today's Cuba, where the outcome is predetermined, no dissenting testimony is permitted, and the nation is saturated with one side of a complicated story.
All right, and final question for you, Tim. Yes or no answer. And perhaps it's the most important one. Is Joe Biden envious of Jimmy Carter?
Well, I have to give credit to Graham Noble of LibertyNation.com because he put together the best single subtitle of the year. I wrote a piece on LN basically talking about if you think that things are as bad for Joe Biden as for Jimmy Carter, forget it. They're far worse because there was, at least in Carter, some youth, some vigor, some vitality, some good ideas. He actually did some good things. But with Joe Biden, there's no hope of any of that because he's so obviously flagrantly over the hill. So the subtitle that Graham Noble came up with was Joe Biden, you're no Jimmy Carter.
And on that note, Tim Donner, thank you ever so much.
You're welcome.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Down the road, we discuss red flag laws. But after this short break, we're asking why nobody's willing to admit that Biden is presidente non grata in 2024. Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Will he or won't he? Only his barber knows. President Biden facing record unpopularity in a nation beset by crises. And even members of his own party are poo-pooing the idea that Biden should face the voters once again in 2024. Now, I can think of no one better to help pass the facts than Liberty Nation's Joe Schaefer, so he joins us here today. Welcome back to the show, Joe.
Hello, Mark. Thanks for having me.
So, Joe, a prominent Washington newspaper, a long supporter of all things from the left, came out this week with what I thought was an interesting op-ed saying that the Democrats are inadvertently going to make Donald Trump the 47th president. Now, what's your take on their position on this, but also the fact that they're actually putting this on the front page of their digital site?
This is the Biden angst And that's the larger theme that's going on here. And you've seen it in several other articles in the big box media, which is aligned, of course, with the Democratic establishment. What is most interesting to me is there have been these stories saying Democrats are disillusioned with Biden. They don't want him in 2024. And we're getting some names. AOC's, no surprise. Bernie Sanders, the progressives, that's no surprise. But a DNC, Democratic National Committee staffer, came out giving his name, saying, we can't pretend that things are all going wonderful here in America, because they're not. So that's significant to me when an establishment Democrat is willing to put his name out there criticizing the man who is, like it or not, the face of the Democratic establishment right now. So this is Biden Inc. They know that they've got, what's shaping up to be a loser on their hands right now and a disaster in the White House. The problem is, what are their alternatives? And it was just like in 2020 when they ended up with this guy. The alternatives aren't so great either.
That's exactly my next question. So as you point out, AOC, she came along and kind of debunked the idea that Biden would be getting any progressive support. And that makes me wonder how the radical progressive wing think they can do any better with another candidate, 'cause as you point out here. In 2020, Joe Biden was basically gifted the nomination because the other candidates were too radically left. And so what happened was everybody coalesced around Biden thinking, this way we're not going to scare off those voters who just happen to dislike Trump but don't want radical leftist policies. But he's governed as a radical leftist in many ways. The policies, the agenda, the language of the White House, more specifically. So with voters rejecting it in 2020, how do the progressives think they can really do better in 2024?
I'm not so sure Biden is the ruling as the leftist to the progressive satisfaction. He is a progressive ruling establishment figure. And the emphasis to me is more on establishment. The progressives who want real systemic change cannot be happy with Joe Biden. He is ultimately a swamp guy. So if you're the Democrats, you've heard this spiel before from the progressive left in 2016 and 2020. We're not going to put up with this anymore. We want real change. We don't want an establishment candidate. And what happened at the end? They dutifully got in line, supported Hillary in 2016 like faithful troops, got behind Biden, which was really biting the bullet in 2020. They did not want that guy, but they did. So if you're the Democratic establishment, how concerned are you that AOC and Bernie are giving this talk again? Not really. David Axelrod, who is a very key player in the DNC, the whole Democratic establishment, he's come out publicly already avidly supporting Biden, saying, we don't have better alternatives. The spin on him is bad because he looks old, but he's really doing a great job. Anyone who's being honest can look at that and say it's not true. But what is the signal that's coming out here from key players in the Democratic Party? Hey, we're not willing to let this guy go. It really comes down to the 2022 midterm elections. How much of a bloodbath, if it will be, for Democrats. If things go better than their worst projections, Biden may actually be able to ride this out. If things go as bad as people are saying, he's going to be in real trouble. But the real trouble won't start until you see establishment-aligned Democrats really speaking out against this guy. And except for that one DNC staffer, we really haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, that brings me on to a point about messaging. So at the moment, recently news broke that Keisha Lance Bottoms, who was a one-term mayor and also a potential VP pick for Biden, she's going to be taking over essentially what's a messaging job for the administration, which is really trying to sell the voters that Joe Biden is doing something right, and that seems to be her sole role in the swamp. Now, you mentioned here that Joe Biden, he's looking frail, and a lot of voters are seeing that. But you have the White House press secretary, Jean-Pierre, saying that this isn't even a question we should be asking. What's your take?
Keisha Lance Bottoms, she was very tied into the George Soros form of radical progressivism, which again is also tied into the establishment. So this is kind of trying to keep both sides happy here. There is an uneasy alliance going on with that. Keisha Lance Bottoms has some very radical roots, but you see this every now and then where they try to align with each other. Nancy Pelosi came out avidly endorsing Karen Bass for LA mayor, and she is as radical as it gets in Congress. So that was an attempt, and it didn't really work because they're not natural allies. If you look at what the progressives are as to what the America First faction of the Republican Party is, you see these American First, it's almost an insurgency within the GOP. They are not putting up with rhinos. Adam Kinzinger, Lynn Cheney, they want them out, Liz Cheney. But the progressives go along with it. The progressives keep swallowing the Democratic equivalent of a Cheney and a Kinzinger. And how long can the establishment keep relying on that? How long will progressives be satisfied with really the Democratic Party is becoming the party of the swamp uniparty establishment? As the Republican Party goes more and more America First, you're seeing Bill Kristol types, you're seeing the DC think tank types openly aligning with the Democratic Party. And this is supposedly everything the progressives can't stand. Even a very pro-war foreign policy. I know that the Ukraine war is popular in Democratic ranks, but progressives are supposed to be against the military-industrial complex. How much of this are they going to keep swallowing? They've been swallowing it for a long time, since Hillary Clinton in 2016. I think that this faction can break up, and that should be the big story of the 2022 midterm elections. If it is a total fiasco for Democrats, you're going to see progressives angry and not willing to go along with what the DNC is telling them they have to go along with.
Yeah, Joe Biden warned American voters that the Republican Party today is not the Republican Party of your grandfathers. And I think the same could be said for the Democratic Party of today. It's not the Democratic Party of your grandfathers, grandmothers, and all those in between. Joe Schaefer, thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Coming up after this short break, we're back with Scott D. Cosenza to talk red flag laws. Now, don't go anywhere. It's going to be quite the show. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
An agreement on gun measures has been reached by a group of 10 Democrats and 10 Republicans and looks set to provide the framework for a piece of legislation which could, in theory, pass the evenly split Senate with 60 votes. Now, one of the biggest aspects of this apparent agreement is that of enhanced risk protection orders, or red flag laws to the hoi polloi. Controversial? Yes. Political? Almost certainly. Good law? Well, that's a question best suited to constitutional attorney and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Thank you, Mark. And we can just stop it right here. I'll just give you the answer. It's no.
All right, good. Thank you for listening to Liberty Nation Radio. We'll be back next week. Now, Scott, first things first. Can you give us a brief outline of what a red flag law is? Now, I'm aware it exists in many iterations across the states, but just general.
Well, before we do that, let's just say that the federal law that's contemplated, as I understand it, and of course the devil will be in the details most certainly, is not of any kind of federal red flag law, but some kind of grant system or otherwise incentivizing states that don't have red flag laws to enact them. So I just want to put that out on the table. And basically a red flag law, broadly speaking, means that somebody can call up the authorities and say, I think that this person is a risk to themselves or others, and I think you should go and take their guns away from them. And in very short order, with notification to them or not, a judge may rule on that and order those guns be taken with really little to no due process often. And that's sort of the objection of most of us who are opposed to such laws, is that they don't grant due process to the person subject to the red flag laws, or the process that is granted is insufficient.
I think that's the main criticism that I've heard of them, that they have the potential to deprive someone of their rights, their constitutional rights, without ever having the opportunity to either argue their case, or in some circumstances, they're not even aware that such a thing is happening until somebody knocks on the door.
That's just one of the Yes, Mark, that's the initial onset and the deprivation of due process there. But just so we're clear, the deprivation of due process continues on throughout the process. And you're right, that order can be granted without even necessarily the knowledge of the person it's being granted against. And for those of us who have spent time in the criminal justice system,
as a lawyer, we assume, Scott, rather than
yeah,
a resident.
I haven't been I think I've represented myself as a speeding ticket, but other than that, thankfully, no personal involvement, no professional involvement in the criminal justice system, especially in family court or abuse court, where people do regularly lie, Mark. People lie about other people that they lie because they have hurt feelings. They lie because they want to seek advantage for money, for child custody, for all sorts of reasons, for leverage over other people. And so, I'm sorry, you were going to say?
Yeah, I want to pick up on that point in particular, because you and I, we've discussed these laws before, and we talked about how they could easily be used to target people with whom someone has a disagreement. Now, if you could you explain how that would play out? Theoretically,
sure. Mr. Smith lives across the street from me. I hate Mr. Smith because he always parks his ugly truck in front of my house, and I wish he didn't. And his kids are nasty, and 3 other reasons. And so, for a person who does not have the strong impetus not to lie to authorities and really set them on their neighbors, that's the hypothetical. They call and they say, and maybe Mr. Smith even said to them, watch yourself, watch your back. I'll do X, Y, or Z. Not, in other words, the person who's receiving that information doesn't even receive it as a true threat, but they can report it as a true threat. So they call and they say, Mr. Smith threatened to kill me and my family because I yelled at him about his truck again. And I think he's a danger to the community. And depending on who that complaint goes to, and this is different throughout the states, it might be a police agency, it might be a prosecuting attorney, and what they want to do with it, they can go to court and get an order that says that Mr. Smith, the police are to go to Mr. Smith's house, enter it, and seize all firearms there, and until such time as there's a hearing to determine whether he gets, the next step in the process.
And what is the next step in that process, Scott? How does it play
So basically,
out?
Generally speaking, there's an emergency order that is granted initially, and then there is usually within a certain number of days, 10, 15 days, a more formal hearing with more regular due process that the person can go to and then fight for their rights. This is the problem with this thing is you have to then fight to keep your rights, right? That rather than the default position, which is that the state should have to, by evidence beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal sense, take them away from you.
So this could be a very undue burden. This is an undue burden for somebody to get their rights back, and unless, of course, they are actually a danger to themselves or others. But
one of the things
while it's being investigated, it's certainly an undue burden, isn't it?
One of the things that Congress could do in its legislation giving grants to states to enact these laws is require that follow-up hearing. So let's just say, forget about the due process to get the guns in the first place. That may be a lost cause. And if it is, there's still a lot that people who respect gun rights can do in order to effectuate due process for the gun owner. So for instance, Mark, you could require that states require a court-appointed counsel for the person who has the red flag issued against them right away in order to prepare for that hearing for them to keep their rights. Also, that any order granted at any subsequent hearing could have an automatic expiration or a quick expiration. So if the impetus really is to staunch the bleeding like a tourniquet, well, okay, fine, but we don't leave a tourniquet on for months or years, right?
Well, your arm falls off if you do.
Yeah, exactly. And sadly, that's something that we would fear that would happen, figuratively speaking, with guns and gun rights, is that they'll just wither away. Also, and this is something that only the gun collector, the person that really is a gun person, would care about, but there are lots of those people, which is that the storage actually be safe. And what I mean by that is there are sort of legion of cases that the ATF would go and seize somebody's guns, or the local sheriff department would go seize somebody's guns, and they put them in a bucket underneath like a dripping pipe, basically in the basement for a year. And then when they get them back, they're ruined. So just kind of like that they take care to preserve, what they have seized, for instance. And again, so rapid action, but not rapid without the, I keep wanting to say accused, because that's sort of where I go with this, but it's not accused. It's a civil procedure, right? But subject. Rapid action favoring the due process rights of the person whose rights are being extinguished, or at least paused, I guess, maybe they would say.
Let's say someone is flagged and the judge agrees, the individual, they lose their firearms for a period of time. But what if that was done as part of a revenge scenario? What punishment would the false accuser face, if any? And how difficult would it be? I guess this is the more tricky question. How difficult would it be to prove that they acted maliciously just to circumvent a process, or to imbue punishment?
Well, yeah, it's all sort of wrapped up. It's all sort of wrapped up into one question. And I would say that it's unlikely that anybody will be prosecuted for this. The first thing that you would want, I think, is to require that they sign an affidavit swearing to the statements they're making in furtherance of getting a red flag law, lodged against someone. And it depends on the prosecutor and how motivated they are. So in certain jurisdictions, we may see prosecutors, who are motivated to do this, and in others, and in most, I think we won't see that. I don't see even the congresspersons who make a point of declaring themselves to be pro-gun and get a lot of support and succor from the gun rights movement. I don't see them leading with, hey, we're all for these things, provided that there are robust protections for I'll just say the accused. And so that troubles me. And I expect that what we'll have is a system whereby not that many people or any people are stopped from mass murder, but lots of dads who are fighting for custody battles are going to get red flag laws against them, and people who are dismissed from work for something they disagree with and make a stray comment out the door are now going to have, police come to their homes. And inevitably what will happen is it will lead to the death of some people who are, kind of at war with the police about this. And I just don't think that there's any indication that, this will actually yield a benefit to public safety, and will certainly have a great cost to the people's liberty.
Yeah, Stephen Crowder, the host of Louder with Crowder, he said that he would be willing to accept such red flag laws on the understanding that anybody who files a malicious claim against somebody is subject to 10 years imprisonment.
Yeah, the problem with that, I think, Mark, is getting if the DAs don't care about it and they don't investigate it, then you're never going to get any follow-up on it. So even if that was part of the law, I don't see it as much relief for gun owners. So what you're saying is the prosecution of such things would be political. Well, yes, absolutely. The decision to prosecute is a political decision, Mark.
What a surprise that red flag laws would come down to politicization. Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thanks, Mark. Cheers.
And that almost wraps it up for this week on Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Tim Donner, Joe Schaefer, and Scott D. Cosenza for joining us. And of course, I want to thank you, the listeners, for being here and making the whole thing worthwhile. Now, my parting shot for this week. We know that it's all political theater, and they know that we know. And of course, we know that they know that we know. But it seems they just don't care that we know. So where does this leave us? Are we captive audiences forever doomed to keep buying the same old ticket to the same shows again and again like some Kafkaesque nightmare? I'd like to think that we're not. I prefer to believe that the theater is a collaborative act, one that we must be involved in for it to work. No longer should these shabby actors have the stage all to themselves. It's our production, and it's our stage, and ultimately, it's our world. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style. Fight for freedom.
Daily tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.